Hey there, everybody. My name is Mary Kate, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. A lot of our returning webinar participants have been asking for a case study webinar, so today we have one of our customers, Pfizer, here to present to you on their experience using file analysis to support mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and governance. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and as always, we will do our best to get to them or follow up with you after if we run out of time. And now I'm going to hand it over to one of our senior consultants at Integro, David Starkweather, to introduce our presenter.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar series. Each month here at Integro, we take 30 minutes to share what we're seeing in the market with regards to information governance. And today, as Mary Kate mentioned, we're fortunate enough to have one of our own customers, Joe Whittemore from Pfizer, on the line to share some of Pfizer's journey around using file analysis to support their mergers and acquisitions, divestiture, and governance activities. Joe is a senior manager in the Enterprise Records and Information Management Group at Pfizer. And Joe, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. Pleased to be here. So as David said, we're going to walk through how Pfizer has begun using StoredIQ to support our mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, governance activities in the records management group. So, brief agenda, we'll talk about Pfizer's Ihram group, who we are, what some of the challenges we face. We'll also look at how we've used StoredIQ and content classification in partnership with Integro, and how we're using it primarily to support our ACD activities, acquisitions, collaborations, divestitures. And then we'll briefly also look at some other potential use cases that we envision in the future for the tool. Okay. So a little bit about us first. So the Ihram team at Pfizer, we manage the ingest, storage, retrieval, disposition of inactive company records, both physical and electronic, across the entire enterprise. So we are a global company, as you would expect, and have records in multiple locations in every business unit: research, finance, R&D, manufacturing. Ihram provides custodial care of those records throughout the retention period. So we don't own the records, we just take care of them for the record owners. We track and manage retention requirements and legal holds on the records. Where do our records come from? Well, a lot of it comes from retired and decommissioned computerized systems. As those systems are being taken offline, we ingest those records and bring them in. We also see records coming through from what we call performance archives. So as systems are getting full of data and slowing down, we take the oldest data, the oldest inactive data offline, archive it so that those systems continue to perform at a level we expect them to. And then lastly, a lot of it comes from ACD activities. So site closures, when we sell an IP, intellectual property, when we merge with another company, we acquire another company, we get a lot of activities that stems from those activities. And that's primarily what we're going to talk about this afternoon, is those ACD activities. So some of the use cases then. We'll talk about acquisitions first. So that's probably the biggest area that we see a challenge in. The challenge is that we inherit these large collections of unknown, unstructured content. And it can come from a variety of sources like file shares and SharePoint sites and Box, network drives, PST, Outlook files, email files. They come from everywhere, all over the landscape. Well, that collection of records, if you will, we receive a collection of unknown records, and they often contain mixed record types. A single collection may have records that span finance and HR and R&D, as well as others. That collection of records may also contain what we call rot. It's files that are redundant, that are obsolete, that are transient or trivial. That may include things like copies and templates and duplicate files, and things that are, personal content, someone's vacation photos that they've stuck up on a file share or a SharePoint site to share with their colleagues. So we see a lot of rot across the collection of records. And then there's other information, other files that we don't consider to be a company record at Pfizer. So that's considered rot. So the challenge then in doing that is how do I evaluate and classify that collection of acquired records? The challenge is because we've lost subject matter experts. Anyone that knew anything about those records are long gone. Maybe we picked up data from an acquired company. The subject matter experts from those companies are now gone. So we have this orphan content, and you can see sometimes those orphans are cute, like you see in the picture. But who wants to have all these orphans in their company? And we also represents a mixed record types, as we talked about, finance and R&D and HR. Well, the challenge then is it becomes very inefficient or impractical to review those large volumes of content. It can be tens of thousands of files or more, sometimes terabyte collections of terabytes size or more. Very cost effective, very time consuming to try to figure out exactly what those records entail. So I like to use this analogy. A mixed record collection is like a ball pit. You got a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You've got some for sake of simplicity, some red records and some orange records and some blue records. They may be finance and HR and R&D. So you get the idea. It's like a ball pit, a big mix of collection. Well, in those records is also what might be rot. You can see a cute picture of a child sitting in this ball pit. And while it's cute, it doesn't represent a record. And that's what we find with rot often. There's some nice files, maybe somebody's, again, their vacation photos that they stored, some information that somebody may find helpful or put it there for a reason, but it doesn't represent a company record. And we don't want to put rot into our archives. We want to keep it out. So the typical solution, what we've done historically, is let's just ingest everything. Let's take everything that we see in that collection and move it into our archives. Well, because it's time consuming to figure out what it is, it costs money to do some analysis. Let's just ingest the entire collection. We'll give a best guess. We'll make our best guess as to what we think these records are. The records came from a site that manufactured product. Well, maybe we'll give it a manufacturing classification code, or if it's from an R&D site, an R&D code. Whatever has the longest retention possible, we're likely to do that. So what happens? Well, we end up over storing records. We do that as a risk-based approach. We want to make sure that no company records are lost. But the problem is you end up with this warehouse, like in the picture here, the Indiana Jones movie, if you're familiar with that, trying to find the lost ark in that sea of records because we've just took in everything. So what does that do? It results in large volumes of unknown content that is likely misclassified, may contain rot, and we can't readily search it, find it, dispose of it, do anything with it because we really don't know what we've got. So that's the challenge. And that's been the typical solution is let's just take it into archives. We don't want to lose company records. Well, what would be a better solution? Well, a better solution, of course, would be to evaluate and classify every record in the collection. But as we talked about already, that's just not very practical. It's ineffective, it's error prone, takes a lot of time, and quite frankly, it would be very boring. I don't think I want to sit down and go through terabytes of records to try to classify them all manually. And it begs the question, where would you even start? How do you even start to figure out what you've got when you inherit these large collections of records of mixed record types? Well, maybe you could hire a team of sorters. Maybe your kids or grandkids would want to plow through your records and figure out what they are for you. And I like these little pictures, but you can see the kids in the lower right there have done a pretty good job of sorting those balls by color. But can you imagine the time that it took to do that? Well, maybe you might even want to hire an extra special colleague to do that for you. I think if I had to go through terabytes of records, I'd go bazingas by the end of the day. Interestingly enough, if you're a fan of Big Bang Theory, there's a video that goes with this picture. So if you just Google Sheldon in the ball pit, you'll find a funny video that you can watch on YouTube. So what is Pfizer Solution? We partnered with Integro, and we purchased Stored IQ and content classification. We're using those tools to index and analyze these large collections of records. Multiple collections and repositories. We've used it against Documentum. That was our first target, was a Documentum repository, but we've subsequently used it on SharePoint and Box and file shares and PSD files. We use the tool to compare that analyzed index content to known record types in our retention schedule, our enterprise records retention schedule. Doing that comparison, training the tool, if you will, with known content, then gives us a suggested probability that a document in the wild matches one of those trained categories in our retention schedule. So now, rather than making a best guess effort based on the site or the activity that took place at a site, we let the tool tell us the probability that a collection of documents may be a finance document or an R&D document or a manufacturing document. We've also used the tool to confirm or update our record classification when we made those best guess efforts. Let's use the tool to tell us, did we get it right? Did we make the right best guess? If not, then let's update it. And we use the tool to help eliminate rot. Let's keep that garbage out of our archives before it ever gets in there in the first place. Okay. So some of the challenges that we encountered, we started with an early version of Stored IQ, and you see the version number there. We were at FixPack 11. So some of the challenges that we faced initially were around image-based PDF documents. We found that documents that were not digitally born, that were not created as PDF, that were scanned to PDF, were image-based files. The tool skipped over those. It did not index those. Working with Integro, and we were able to get a fix for that that's been released since version 11. We also saw challenges with non-English documents. As I mentioned, Pfizer is a global company, so we have many documents that are across the enterprise that are not written in English. So the tool, that presented some challenges for us, primarily trying to figure out, well, how do we even classify those records? If I can't read something in Italian, for example, how do I even know for sure what I have? So we faced some challenges there. Another big one was documents with overlays. So we had documents that had an overlay applied to them in the document management system. It may be a pedigree, a date, or some label tags that were applied to the records. Those overlays were often read ahead of the document contents, particularly if the documents were scanned. If they were scanned to PDF and then there was an overlay applied to it, the tool read that overlay as if it were content. So we faced some challenges there. And then probably the biggest challenge that we faced was what's called overlapping intent. These are records that have common components or similar characteristics. The incidents that we saw with overlapping intent was directly related to the complexity and the number of classification types that we were trying to hit. At Pfizer, we have a very complex, deep, 3-level classification model. We classify records at a primary level. Think of the highest level you might get to, R&D, finance, HR. We then had a secondary level, and then finally a tertiary or a 3rd level classification. That makes our retention schedule very complex and very deep, nearly 200 different classification codes. So that was a challenge for us. As you would expect, when you get to that complexity, you have a lot of overlapping intent. Let me illustrate overlapping intent for you. I live on a lake, and I like to fish and look at the wildlife that exists. Well, overlapping intent illustrate it here. You know, at a primary level, I can easily tell the difference between a frog and a fish and a turtle. I can look at the lake I live on and I can see those animals and I can readily determine the difference between those. The secondary level, I can still pretty well tell the difference between a northern pike and a bass. If I catch one of those on my hook, they're pretty easy. It's pretty obvious, even from the water, what I've got. By the time I move down to my tertiary level, now the difference between a largemouth bass and a smallmouth bass, you can see that there's similarities. They have similar characteristics. The tail fins are similar and the dorsal fins. They look a lot alike. Now think about that with records. You know, at a primary level, R&D looks very different than a record from HR versus a manufacturing record. But as I get deeper into our retention code, those similarities become more apparent. Where did we see it at Pfizer? Well, we saw it primarily in a few documents. One was a certificate of analysis documents, and you see an example there on the right side of a certificate of analysis document. Those documents are produced in our company by different groups, manufacturing, our R&D groups, and our quality groups. So we have different retention requirements for each one of those groups based on the need of that document, but they look alike. So that certainly presented a challenge for us. And then another one was in our research study protocols and our reports. We classify records based on whether they're regulated or non-regulated by the FDA. And you can see an example there of an acquired research study protocol that came from an acquired company, from Pfizer. The difference between this report, a regulated report versus a non-regulated report, they're very similar. So the tool had a difficulty trying to distinguish between the two of them. So what did we learn from it? Well, working with Integro, and particularly David, who's on the call, is we needed to avoid that overclassification. When you try to get so deep in your classification, that's where the challenges lie. So we had to create bigger buckets, avoid that overclassification. You know, I could break this car down into 1,000 parts and try to identify each one uniquely. But do I really need to do that? So what's the appropriate level of classification that you want to hit? And that was our challenge that we had to learn. So what did we realize? Well, we did a proof of concept working with Integro, and when we backed our retention code up to the right level of classification, we were able to see an 82% accuracy on a first match. So that suggested first match retention code was at 82% accuracy. By the time we reached out to the fifth match, we were at greater than 90% accuracy. Again, when you hit the right level of classification. Some of the out of the box analysis that we also realized from using the tool was we could readily identify duplicates, 2 or more files. Even if the file names didn't match, we could readily find files that had social security numbers, credit card numbers, files over a certain size, and files that hadn't been modified in a select number of years. So that was very helpful for us. So we talked a lot about acquisitions. Well, collaborations. We often have to convey some of our unstructured data. We have intellectual property that needs to be conveyed to a company that we're collaborating with. Well, the challenge with that is how do we segregate out the right IP, the right intellectual property, and not over divest or divulge other information that shouldn't be part of that collaboration. So we use StoredIQ to help review unstructured data prior to sending it to a collaboration partner so that we could isolate sensitive intellectual property and to keep those from being divested. So Pfizer successfully completed the migration of file data to a collaborator by isolating the files that had select Pfizer IP that would have otherwise been migrated. So how do the StoredIQ report that we used was called the term hits report, which was very helpful for us. Once the data was indexed, we used that term hit report to isolate the content based on select keywords. We've also used it in divestiture activity. We had a site closure, a legacy company site that had been used for decades, that had again, a sea of historical content, mixed record types, a lot of record categories that needed to be evaluated and determined, what do we have here, what needs to be retained, and what can be disposed of. We also needed to transfer some of the product-related IP to another manufacturing site. So how do we identify and isolate just that specific content? So again, StoredIQ, we used the duplication reports, aging reports, file type reports were very helpful. The tool told us what files were computer-based files, EXE and INIs and DOCX as template files that don't represent company records. And we also used the term hit reports. Again, going back to that site closure, so we had a legacy manufacturing facility. We had a file share that contained about 10 terabytes of content. It had been used by multiple departments, again, a mixed record collection for decades, I may add. And those company records needed to be identified and preserved, but we also knew there was likely a lot of rot. And many of the SMEs, subject matter experts, had already exited. They had left the company. Some of them had left for years. So that was a challenge for us. How do we identify what records do we need to keep, what classification, what can we dispose of? So the actions we took, we indexed that file share with StoredIQ. We identified rot. We found the media, the photos, the system files, the duplicates, and we were able to dispose of 60% of the content. 60% of that 10 terabytes was determined not to be a company record. That was a huge savings for us in terms of storage cost and classifying the records appropriately. So the remaining content was categorized at the primary level. If you remember, our retention code has 3 levels, so we classified it at that primary level and we archived it. So where do we see, where's Pfizer going in the future with StoredIQ? Well, we can see it, working smarter with our ACD activities. I'm not sharing anything proprietary here. We are working with a joint venture with GSK. It's going to produce the world's largest consumer health over-the-counter company. We have a lot of records that will need to be divested out to the joint venture. StoredIQ will be a great tool for us to find and isolate those records so we can pull them out. We'll also use it for future record classification. Our current repositories of records, we can then analyze those and also look at future sources of data coming in. We also see it potentially supporting our GDPR activities. We can identify content with personally identifiable information and help us to respond to individual rights requests. If somebody says, I need my data erased, or tell me what you've got. So StoredIQ gives us a lot of activity that we've done to support our ACD activities. We see a lot of future use, and we're beginning to explore that. That's what I had to share. So Mary Kate, David, I will turn it to you to see if there are any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. That was really a great presentation. It simplified everything and made us laugh. So thank you again for joining us today. We do have a couple questions, and there is a few minutes left. So if anybody else wants to ask some, just press that orange arrow in your screen and you can send one in. But the first one here is, how long did the records identification pieces take in contrast to other approaches you considered?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. So our initial target for StoredIQ was about 40 terabyte collection in Documentum. We didn't even consider trying to analyze those manually. That would have just taken way too long. Even trying to hire consultants, it would have been not feasible. So we use StoredIQ to index those records, and it really is dependent on a couple of things. One is the platform. Documentum was a little slower than perhaps a file share. Also, the proximity of the StoredIQ installation to where the data is. The further, the more jumps you've got to go through on a network connections, the slower it is. So we ended up using 3 data servers to harvest that 40 terabytes in Documentum, and it took 3 to 4 months, I believe, to fully index the data.
Got it. Thank you. We have another one for you. Did you find considerable amounts of company records or intellectual property in email, or was that mostly rot?
In email, we were looking for select IP. So we analyzed PST files looking for certain IP, intellectual property terms, to isolate those. So that was primarily where we used that. We weren't looking to see, are there company records in email? That's not primarily a source that we would expect to find records. So it was really looking for, can we find select intellectual property messages that have intellectual property, so we can divest those out to a company, a partner company.
Great, thank you. We have one more question here, and then I will have David sign it out for us after you're done answering. But this one says, does the classification or indexing process primarily based off keywords? Does that mean for record classification XXX, keywords should be identified so the tool can map against it? And they also said, thank you, great presentation.
Well, thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it. I'll let David answer better how the tool finds content. Certainly keywords is helpful. Keywords is a component of indexing records or classifying records, but that's not the primary aspect. I believe more of it is a comparison, a digital thumbprint, if you will, a comparison of known documents. You feed the tool, you create a knowledge base based on known documents. And so you provide the tool with a subset of known documents. We know these documents are in this category. The tool then begins to recognize what they look like and then compares those two documents in the wild. David, did I answer that appropriately?
Yeah, you absolutely did, Joe. Yeah, so we train a classification model to recognize your content, and we do feed it representative samples to train that model. And after we get enough samples, the tool can start to recognize it on its own. And yeah, that's exactly what we did. It creates a digital fingerprint, if you will, for each category. And then when we classify documents, it compares the incoming documents to the digital fingerprint we have on file, and it determines how much of a match we have.
David, can I jump in here real quick? Joe, if you're up for it, we actually have one more question here. I know I just messed up the flow of it, but I'll ask this one and then we can sign off. This one says, what advice can you give in terms of scalability of the review process?
Finding those representative samples is probably the biggest challenge. It's the documents that you're going to train the tool with. You really need to know what those are and get the right level of classification. We tried to go too deep at one point and just ran into a lot of headaches and challenges. When you back it up to the right level of classification, the picture of the car with all the parts, you get to the right level and the tool works very well. So the deeper you go into your classifications, the more challenge you'll face. But finding those representative samples was probably the most time-consuming activity. And we had multiple people reviewing those documents to ensure we had them right.
Thank you very much. All right, that looks like all the questions that we have. So David, I'll have you close it out, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, everyone, again, for joining today's call. We hope you found some value in it. And as always, if you have any questions later on, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Also, if you have any topics you'd like to see us cover in a future webinar, drop us a line and let us know that as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.